Today I'm going to talk about some fun ways that you can add texture to aluminum sheets made from beer and soda cans. So you're going to be starting with flattened aluminum sheets, and if you need some tips on how to do that, I will link to a little mini course that I have on different ways to break down the cans, how to flatten them, how to get the tops off. There's a lot of information there. If you're new to working with aluminum cans, you'll want to check that out. So today I'm just going to be starting with my sheets of metal that have already been cut from the can and flattened into flat sheets. And I'm going to talk about 3 different ways that you can add some hand texturizing to the metal. So I've determined that there are 3 main types of ways to add texture to your metal, and I've just named them hammering, rubbing, and drawing. And for the hammering, obviously you want some sort of hammer. I recommend a rubber mallet over a regular construction hammer, but if you only have a metal hammer, you can certainly use that too. And then the other thing you're going to need is an embossing tool, and these are very inexpensive. You can find them at Dollar Tree sometimes. You can buy them in sets with all different sizes of embossing tips. And then you'll need an embossing pad or some sort of soft surface to emboss on. And I just have a piece of t-shirt here for my soft surface. So I've used this textured metal to make a lot of different projects. I've made some covers for notebooks and art journals, and I've also made some earrings using a texturizing method. I used some little textured pieces for the top of a cabinet that I covered with aluminum cans. And I've also added some texture to the aluminum sheets to make garden markers. So those are just some of the things that you can do with your texturized metal sheets. So the simplest way to add texture to a metal sheet is to use a sort of rough surface and your hammer. And you can use a paved sidewalk. I just have a paving stone here, and I've got kind of the rough, raw edge up. And I'm just going to hammer with my rubber mallet on both sides of the sheet, so I can flip it over and hammer on both sides until I have added as much texture as I want to. So you can add a little bit or a lot, and if you do, you're going to want to hammer on both sides because it will help to flatten the sheet and keep the metal flat. So you can probably see some of the texture coming through already. And it doesn't matter if your sheet moves around because you're just adding a very random pattern or texture to your aluminum sheet. So I'm just going to continue hammering until I get the desired amount of texture that I'm looking for. I should mention that whenever you are adding texture to your aluminum sheets, you are going to sort of add some waviness, and your sheets are not going to remain completely flat because that's just the nature of adding the texture. But with all of the methods, if you are adding some texture from both sides, it will help to keep your metal flatter. And we'll talk more about that when we go into some of the other methods. But you can see that this hammering did sort of add a little bit of a curve and a little wave to the metal, which you can sometimes smooth out with your fingers. If you're using some glue on your project, you can get the metal nice and flat again. So just be aware that you are going to change the shape of your metal as you're adding texture. So another idea for adding texture to your metal is to use some cording. And what I've done here is I've just taken some painter's tape. I laid down my cording on the metal, sheet, and then I just used some painter's tape to tape it down, and then again I just hammered from both sides. So you can see this gives you kind of a subtle raised area. If you want to try to make your raised areas a little bit deeper, you can add your pad underneath. And what this does is it just allows the impression to go in a little bit deeper because you're not hammering on a hard surface. So that's a second idea of ways to add texture. You could probably also coil some wire to hammer on. You just want to make sure you're not using something that will get too smashed when you are hammering. But you can probably come up with some additional ideas. I'm going to try one more hammered design, and for this pattern I'm using the top ring of the aluminum can. So just this little lip portion right here. And again, if you're interested in how to get down to this piece, check out my little mini course. And then my little smaller pieces, these little marquee shapes, are the ring which is cut into quarters, and then I've just taped them together into this little shape. So I'm going to go ahead, I've got these kind of laid out where I want them, and then I'm going to tape them down with some more painter's tape. And then I will be ready to do my hammer technique again on this design. Now it is a little tricky to tape and not move your pieces. If you want to, you can tape a little bit at a time, or you can just try to get the whole thing covered and hope your pieces don't shift too much. I think I'm just gonna try to go for it here. You don't have to get in between all the pieces, but you do want to make sure your tape's not going to slide around. Just going to wrap this around the end a little bit because it doesn't seem super secure, and I don't want my pieces to move around. So one note on this, if you do decide to use the aluminum can rings like I did here, you want to be sure to have the smooth rim portion facing your metal and not this rougher edge where I've removed the metal. You can see right here, I thought I had all of the pieces the right direction, but I have this one upside down, so you can see it's a little more jagged and it's kind of puncturing through the metal a little bit more, whereas where I have the smooth rim up, I'm getting a nice clean smooth edge. So that's just a note, if you do use your aluminum can rings to make some texture, you want to be sure to use the smooth side against the metal. So I'm going to move to the next technique, and this is what I call the rubbing technique. So I'm just going to take a small piece of tape here, and for this pattern I'm going to use some old coins. So I just just have a few options here. And I'm going to stick them to my tape. Now I want to stick the side that I don't want to print onto the tape side. So I think on this side I'm going to use the little eagle shape. You do want to be a little bit careful. You don't want to use things that are have a lot of difference in the width or the depth of the piece. This is a little thicker than this piece, but I think it'll be okay. So once you have your pattern designed, you can go ahead and flip it onto the metal, and you want to put your print on the printed side of the metal so you'll get your impression on the aluminum side where you can see it. So I'm going to start with one of my embossing tools with a fairly large tip. You don't have to use, you can use any size, but you just are going to cover more ground if you have a bigger tip. And I'm just going to rub across my metal. And once I've located all of my outside edges, I can switch to a smaller tool and just start to get a little more detailed. So hopefully you can start to see some of the details coming through here, and you can work on it as much or as little as you want to really bring out some of the details. Another way you can add texture is with embossing folders, and you don't have to have a Big Shot or a Sizzix machine to use the folders. I just found this one at the thrift store, so I picked it up just because I thought it would be fun to play around with. So for this technique, you want to make sure you have your metal taped very securely. So I'm going to start by sliding my metal into the folder. So I want to tape it securely to this side of the folder. You can use either side of the embossing folder, but if you have one side that has more raised areas, I found that that side works better than the side with more indentations. So you're going to want a piece of metal that's kind of oversized and bigger than your embossing folder if you try to do this technique. So I've got this taped as securely as I can here, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of take my embossing tool and rub the entire surface. So you can see the patterns already coming out here, and I probably could use a bigger embossing tool, but this one is an embossing tool that I got at Dollar Tree, and it's still my favorite. It's just kind of the easiest one to hold on to, and it's just got the two sizes that I use the most on the tips. So I'm going to finish one pass on this just to pull out the whole design. And here again, you can emboss as much or as little as you want to. If you are happy with the level of detail that you have, you can go ahead and finish here, or you can go in and just keep working it and really pull out the design. The final method that you can use for adding texture to your aluminum sheets is what I'm calling drawing. And for that method, you're going to use your embossing tool, and you're going to need your pad and your sheet of aluminum. And one of the techniques that I find the most soothing and kind of fun to do is what I call doodle embossing. And so that's just a very free form kind of drawing on the metal. And I always start on the soft surface on the back side of my aluminum. And what I mean by doodle drawing is just drawing sort of random patterns. And it is a little hard to see on this side, so I flip it over a lot and just kind of see where I'm at with things. And when I'm going back in to reinforce my lines, I'm just going to draw right up along the edge. So I'm not pushing that indentation back down, I'm just kind of reinforcing it on the side. And when I'm doing the reinforcing, I want to work on a hard surface. And when I'm actually doing the drawing, I want to work on my padded surface. So I'm just going to draw some doodles until I've filled in my sheet. If you want to, you can reinforce your lines and try to make them deeper and thicker. So you can just work with the design until you have it as thick or as deep as you want your pattern to be, and you don't have to just go over it once, you can go over it several times. And the final way to add an impression is to actually use some artwork that you're going to trace. So you can do words and lettering this way, or I have a little sketch of one of our dogs that I'm going to try to do. It might be a little complicated, but I'm going to give it a shot. You do want to stick with very simple designs, and you're just going to trace over your printed lines, which are taped to the printed side of the metal to make the impression on the silver side again. And then I'm going to reinforce the back of the design just to pull out the design by flipping it over, just the way I did with the doodle embossing or the freehand drawing. The one thing you do need to do if you are doing a sketch or following an actual printed pattern is you want to mirror that image, especially if you're doing any wording, because the image will be flipped once you have it on the other side. And when you're following a design, you want to just be very careful not to slip off of your lines. And sometimes it's hard to, see where you've been. So just work slowly. And if you're careful, you should have something resembling your drawing when you're done. So those are the three methods of adding textures to your aluminum sheets that I know of that you can do by hand without any fancy machinery. But you can also combine techniques. So for example, you can add additional embossing or the rubbing technique to your hammered designs. So if I want to make this indentation of my shapes a little bit deeper, I can just follow that line with my embossing tool. And you can trace the inside and the outside. I like to just do one or the other, and I'm just tracing the inside edge here. So hopefully you can see how different that looks when you add a little additional depth to the pattern. And so you can play around with combining the different techniques as well. If you haven't already, be sure to check out my free mini course, Introduction to Crafting with Aluminum Cans. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.